Lori Loaded, thank you for coming onto the show to talk about. You chose 3 episodes that you wanted to go through. I try to reach out to people and say pick an episode that you want to do, but give me a couple of options in case that we talked about it recently or something like that. And you came back with Measure of a Man, which we've talked about recently, and The Pale Moonlight, and then The Drumhead, which we eventually chose. But I'm curious why you picked those 3 in the first place to be the episodes that you wanted to discuss.
I did. Well, first thing, thanks for having me on. It's always fun to be a part of the Penske File. Love the podcast and the Twitter when we have a conversation. The reason why I chose them was more because the one thing for Trek I think that really pushes, for me at least, is that it challenges us as humans, and it makes us take a look at ourselves, as well as can give moral implications. And so when people ask me what are my favorite ones or what ones do I enjoy talking about, generally it's those, because I think that it's the height of Trek to look at morality or look at ethics or just to question what it is to be human. So
would you say those are the 3 of the best episodes? Would you have all of those in like a top 10, or are those your top 3 episodes of Star Trek?
So I guess
it's not TNG. You have a DS9 episode mixed in as well.
Yeah. I don't know that I would say it was. I'd have to think about that, because again, I think Trek has so many facets to it that it can be tough to say, well, these are just my top 3. I guess so. Again, just going back on what we were discussing, the fact that it is really the pinnacle of Trek when you look at it from that way. I would say, it's probably within the top 10. Probably of the top 10, it's the more serious ones. I'd probably take a look at the ones that are more fanciful or lighthearted within that list after those. But yeah, I'd say they're in the top 10. Yeah.
It's funny. I'd say that Pale Moonlight and Measure of a Man are both overrated episodes of Star Trek. The Drumhead, as we're going to get into, I think might be underrated. But that'll be a little bit of a tease. I'm going to read the information about what this episode is. It's called The Drumhead. As soon as I scroll up, I can say that it is the 21st episode of the 4th season. Came out on the 29th of April, 1991. Written by Jerry Taylor. Directed by Jonathan Two Takes Frakes. In-universe date is 44769.2, which is 2367, some month thereabouts. In this episode called The Drumhead, an overzealous Starfleet Admiral begins a witch hunt aboard the Enterprise, determined to find a conspiracy, and eventually accuses Captain Picard of treason. There's a lot more than that. Admiral Satie. We're going to be talking about The Drumhead. For context, the first time we watched this through, I think I watched it with Tana and Clay, potentially, I think, on the original podcast. I remember, I haven't watched this episode since we did that about 5 years ago. I remembered being down on this, even though I gave it a 5 out of 5 on our scoring thing. It was one of those, this is a 5, but I don't think this is one of the best 5s that the show has ever done. I have it just outside the top 10 in my total overall rankings of Star Trek TNG. I have it at 13, which is meaningless because it changes on a day-to-day basis. But it goes to show where I think that this actually sits, because there's probably only, a handful of 5s in the entire run of shows. And I had The Drumhead outside the top 10 for it. Watching it again, I think I've changed my mind. I think it is a top 10 episode of TNG, which bumps it up slightly. But I was, I think my major takeaway from watching it this time is how much the world has changed in the past 5 years since I watched the episode a while ago. And I think what makes the episode great and that I was underappreciating was how timeless of a concept it is. It has other things going for it, but that's what I'll throw to you. Timeless episode, just good writing. Is there something else going on with this one?
Well, it kind of goes back to what we were saying, and that might deviate a little bit, because I wonder at this time in my life if the world has really changed, or just like our perceptions of the world have changed. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like as a kid, the world seemed a lot safer than it probably was. So I think I would say that it's timeless, because I do think that perhaps this type of atmosphere has existed in one form or another. We just see it more with social media. So I would agree that it's timeless. I think one of the So I'm not sure how much your audience knows about my channel, but or what I do, but I break down Star Trek episodes as well. And one of the most interesting things about it is that regardless of what a person believes or thinks, they turn this episode towards their specific bias. So not only do I think it's timeless, I think that somehow people will justify what they believe, how it speaks to their situation.
Yeah.
So I think it's very special in that way.
It does. It justifies priors. It's interesting. It's what I always see on Twitter is funny because we won't get into it too much, but Star Trek Twitter drives me a little bit crazy.
Oh yeah.
All the subgenres of Twitter drive me a little bit crazy. So you need to mix them all. But there's always this meme that why do conservatives watch Star Trek? That's like a meme that happens in Star Trek Twitter. They say it all the time. I'm not conservative. I don't identify as conservative. But it always feels a little bit silly when they say things like this because I find this episode to be traditionally extremely conservative. It's an extremely conservative point of view, and it's heralded as one of the great Star Trek episodes.
Right.
So the discord between those 2 points of view just goes to show what you were talking about earlier, where this is an episode that really exposes priors in people, and it's what they view is largely what it's how they receive this episode is more what it says about the person than the actual episode, which is really fantastic. I think Jerry Taylor did a terrific job of not being super specific, although she is specific in some ways, which we'll get into. But I think, to toss it back to you, it's an episode that when I was younger, maybe 5 years ago, I would have gone, oh, this is about the Nazis. She's talking about the Nazis. When I was a stupid 20-year-old college kid, I would have been like, this is the Republican Party that she's talking about, whatever. Now that I'm a little bit older, and I believe in like horseshoe theory of politics, right. I'm like, oh, this is everybody. She's literally talking about everybody who has a strong belief about something and is willing to subvert morals, ethics, and good general standing with people in order to make a point.
Right. It's about ideology, and it doesn't necessarily speak to one ideology over the other when you really break down what they're talking about. It's more reflective of not only the information or what's being said or what we're looking at, but how we deal with it. You know, because you see between Picard and Satie, situations occur, and you see how they react to it individually. They have the same information; they're just reacting to it in much different ways. And what I always thought was interesting too is that sometimes, or in some instances, Satie, she goes about it wrong. Her methods are wrong. But maybe not her caution, I think, sometimes. I think that if Satie had handled it in a different way, we wouldn't have the drama, so it wouldn't have done that. But I mean, if it was real life and handled it a different way, people might have agreed with her a bit more.
Yeah, she's one of the technical things I like about this episode is that I think that's an extremely strong script. We're in the middle of an Enterprise watch through, and it's like, my God, like, could Enterprise take a lesson from TNG about how to actually compose a good script? It's super tight. It's everything. An Enterprise episode, which is a lesser Star Trek show, would have shown the explosion right in the cold open. It would have shown all of this stuff. There would have been they wouldn't have had any belief that the audience would buy into the concept without just showing you from the start that there was an explosion. This thing all got shut down. This Admiral came on. The Drumhead starts right in the middle of them knowing that something went wrong. They already have a suspect at hand. We're already well into it. And then each scene is just perfectly constructed to push the thing forward. And you look at something like Enterprise. Enterprise likes to languish and sort of sit around in its scenes. It likes to have a lot of just people sitting and sort of bullshitting each other for whatever reason. This script, and TNG didn't always do it, it just moves and it gets a lot done and it gets it all out of the way and brings everything to light. I think it's probably one of the best scripts that the show ever did in a technical sense. I think it just is tight and effective and memorable and lean at the same time. It's really good writing.
Yeah, it's my understanding it was a bottle show, I think. And if it was, it's definitely how you want to do your bottle shows. Yeah. Which, for those who don't know, it's when you're trying to save money. So you minimize the guest stars and you keep all of the same sets. It's just a money saving, which they've done a couple of those, which is really, really done well.
Interestingly, though, this set is new, right? I'm sure it's not an expensive thing to build, but the set that they're in for the investigations, I don't think has ever been seen on the show before, right?
I thought they redid 10 Forward. I could be wrong about that, but I thought that was just a 10 Forward redressed. I could be wrong. Maybe you're right, and I missed it. And I could be wrong about it being bottle show, but I thought it was.
No, I'm pretty sure it is. But yeah, it's like even... Obviously, it doesn't cost a lot to rebuild that sets, but I was surprised that they didn't just have a more like you could easily see it taking place in the conference room or something like that.
That's what DS9 did with I forget when they put Jadzia on trial, they redressed Quark's
bar, yeah,
yeah. So,
yeah.
So that would be, and I enjoyed that one too, but in Quark's bar makes absolutely no sense. They needed to. The other thing I like. To your point, I think Enterprise gets a little bit better, especially into the Xindi arc. But one thing I liked is they also, and they didn't do this on purpose because this wasn't the way they wrote for TV shows back then, but they used previous episodes to justify what was going on. So we'd had issues with Klingons and Romulans being co-conspirators of people of Klingons thinking that the Romulans are stronger. And so they use that, and they use continuity. And then again, just the stepping stones that put everything together. Again, depending on how Satie could have handled it, it could have made more sense. So they came in because they thought there was a saboteur. They caught the actual saboteur was the Klingon. But then, there was evidence that there could be other things going on. So it is natural to at least take a look at that. You don't want to just ignore it. But then she takes it too far. So, but again, it's not unreasonable. It's not until she...
It's revealed to be an accident. They determine that it's an accident, and that doesn't shut down the investigation. Is the turning point for her? Well,
I'll say this. I think again, she was on a witch hunt and everything. But if you have even if it was an accident that did it, but you have a person that lied and could have a connection to an enemy, you can at least look into that. She went to destroy his life, which obviously is not something that she should have done, but at least doing a little bit more research into it. You know what I'm saying? Take him aside, look at what he's done, clear him, and then just keep him moving. One of the only negative pieces about the episode, I think, is that it seems like his life was either destroyed or hit very detrimentally when I think they had the opportunity to allow him to continue. You know what I'm saying?
They're not very specific about what he speaks kind of like my career is over, but they don't give any actual specifics about what has happened, whether he thinks it's like a reputational thing and no one will ever trust him again, or if there's actually a sanction coming down on him for some reason. So he's certainly ruined by it, although actor-wise, he seems like kind of a nervous Nelly who might be complaining about that kind of stuff anyway. So it's hard to tell, but unless I'm missing something.
At the end, Picard says a man's career lies in ashes or something. Now he could have been dramatic or over flourishing, because I think Picard's base character, unless they just write him out of character, I think his base instinct would probably be to allow the man to continue to serve and grow within the ranks. But he does say it lies in ashes. But again, that could have been some flourish for what his speech that he's doing.
Interestingly, I only picked up in this episode, he's not an officer, that kid. He never went to the academy. He's just he's just a tech or whatever who serves in the sick bay and gives shots. Right. Which is an interesting choice. I guess they did it to make it seem more relatable, so that when it's taken away, you as an audience member go like, oh, this guy didn't even go to college or whatever, and I never went to college and things like that. It's more of like a the Academy is heralded as like this like future of Star Trek and Starfleet and everything, but not being enlisted. This is probably one of the most early acknowledgments that there are people on the ship that aren't enlisted.
I was going to say it's a part of the retcon, because the first First season for sure. Second season too, everybody was an officer, but I think they wanted to make him the everyman, kind of like O'Brien.
Yeah, he's O'Brien. And although I think maybe at this point O'Brien might still have been considered, because they changed that about O'Brien at some point. Yeah,
he was an officer at the beginning too.
Yeah. I think that it's an interesting setup in the development of everything, and her going on this witch hunt is kind of I think it's an effective build. Like, I think narratively the build of her getting more and more desperate to find something wrong matches how you want to like build your climbing action in the story. Like, you want things to be getting worse and worse, and Picard become neutered and more neutered as he's eventually taken off the case and he can't have any impact on things. She's really a lesson in having a determined outlook and then trying to prove it afterwards. Like, she's that failure of a character. She believes something and then is going to work until she finds enough reasons to find that is the outcome that was all but destined. And they do. What do you think of Satie? Is she developed as a character? Or is she just fine for what she needs to be in this episode, which is only 42 minutes long?
Well, I think she's, just going back to that, she's the penultimate Twitter Trekkie, or we don't even have to go to Twitter, but the penultimate person who has an opinion of someone else or a movement and will say something, but even if it's not right, will then say, well, we'll just go and find something, right? Because, I mean, how many times, again, on Twitter or wherever, will someone say something that's untrue, be proven that it's untrue, and then go in search of reasons to justify why they still felt that way anyway?
Keeps you up all night. I think you gotta find that research study that proves what you were saying.
And I think that's where most everyone, whether you're on the right or the left, when watching this, misses the forests for the trees, because her sin isn't that she just hated Romulans or just thought that everyone was a traitor that doesn't believe her. Her ultimate sin, the core failure of her character, was that she was never looking for truth, and she never accepted that someone could be innocent, that she was wrong. Mm-hmm. If for any reason they were proven innocent of something, she would go after something else, and that's the core failure of the character. And what I think Picard was saying we need to fight against. It's specific to the ideology of the person, not necessarily how that ideology comes out. I'm sorry, what were you saying?
Well, Satie's interesting to me because I think that she is effective at what she needs to be in this episode. And her rationale for what she does, I think, makes complete sense. I think the fact that it's only like a 40-something minute show is only really felt at the end when Picard kind of picks up on the fact that her father is the reason that her father being disappointed in her from the grave or whatever is going to be the reason that she finally realizes what's wrong with her. I don't know how they better wrap this up, but it always just strikes me as a little bit, for a character who could have been like a great recurring character or someone who is capable of probably handling a plot, she's easily undone at the end by Picard sort of going off track to take her down. Like he relies on he doesn't beat her in the courtroom, interestingly. It's not that evidence wins out. He basically just triggers her, and that causes her to freak out. And then the Admiral walks out stone-faced. You know, it's an effective, and I think it's a believable ending, but it's also strange that Picard's defeat of her is only that it causes her to crack more than you don't spend that much time with the realization on her part that what have I done kind of thing. It's more, she does realize that, but the episode doesn't spend time on that. It just shows her being broken, and then the credits roll, and that's the end of the episode.
Yeah, I don't know, because I think it does for what they wanted. I don't think they were looking for a reoccurring character. I think they just wanted to do a one-off. But if they were going to do a reoccurring, I guess the best way to write it would be to turn the tables on her. And I'm not sure how you would write that in as pleasing an ending but because when you watch her slow denigration or the destruction, she just turns on everyone and starts bringing up all of their background, right? Everything that they've ever done wrong. She does it to Worf. She does it to Picard. She, of course, does it to the young man. I would have spent some time, either earlier in this episode or in previous episodes, building up her character a little bit, talking about her a little more, getting her background, and then having that turned on her so that she can see that you can make any story. You can make a person into anything you want them to be, because no one is perfect. They're always going to have issues. And then it would take more than 40 minutes. You'd have to have her come back. And if I did it, I'd have her come the way I'd probably do it. I don't know when Measure of a Man was, but if I was going to do something like that, I would have her shown the error of her ways at the end of Drumhead, and then have her representing Data in Measure of a Man.
Oh, sure.
I think if I was going to do that, that's probably how I'd do it.
I was thinking Satie's interesting to me because I think they did improve on what Satie is in a later episode, in a later series, actually. Because what Satie becomes is Sloan in DS9. And I think he's a much better character, and he's much more interesting. And Satie's point of view is actually, to me, a proto-Section 31 ideology. Satie, did you ever read or do you know the book, The Three Languages of Politics?
No, I haven't read that.
I think the guy's name is Robert Kling or something. It's short. I recommend anyone read it. But he makes this argument that the reason that political discourse is so difficult is because people speak in three different languages when they're talking about the same issue. And so people are never technically talking about the same thing, because depending on your point of view, you have a different outlook. So he argues that progressives view every issue through the lens of oppressor versus oppressed, the oppressed versus the oppressor. Conservatives look at everything through the prism of civilization versus barbarism, and libertarians look at everything through coercion versus freedom. So you can look at something like the civil rights movement, which would be, progressives would look at the civil rights movement of the 60s as oppressors, which would be white society oppressing minorities and people of color. Conservatives would look at it as, we can't change the rules, because if we change the rules, civilization will fail at that point, and that this is the way that you need to keep going. And libertarians would say, it's not within the state's right to tell people what to do. So passing something like the Civil Rights Act is actually immoral, because it gives state coercive powers over people that would take away their freedom. And obviously, some arguments are better than others. The progressive argument seems to make sense in the civil rights context. The other two seem like they're pretty bad arguments when all things are said and done, but you can look at it in a lot of different ways for all different issues. Satie, to me, is the conservative in his point of view. So Satie sees everything as civilization, which is Starfleet, is being taken apart by barbarism. So if they're not there protecting what Starfleet stands for, then society breaks down. And that, these are the things that we have to protect. The enemy is at the gates, and we can't let that happen. Sloan in Section 31, when they're actually well written and make sense, is the pinnacle of that argument, which is that we have to, in order to protect what we have, which is important, we have to do underhanded things that compromise our values, because if we don't do it, the enemy will take over, and loss of civilization is worse than us dirtying our hands in certain kinds of ways. What's interesting about Sloan, and why I think he's a better character, is that Sloan recognizes what he's doing in himself actively and admits that what he's doing is the wrong moral choice, but that someone has to do it. Like, you get to sleep well, doctor, at night because of men like me out there doing things that you don't think that you can do. Satie is a little bit more ignorant to that. She doesn't really realize what she's doing is wrong, which it causes her to break down at the end. So I think that she's a little bit more prototypical and a little bit less interesting, just because I like Sloan recognizing that he's doing the wrong thing, but for what he considers to be better reasons, which I actually agree with him. I do like Sloan in Section 31. I think he makes a convincing argument. But Satie is more of a TNG TOS model of a character, which is that she can't see the truth that Picard is going to expose to her. So I find her a little bit less compelling in that regard, but it works much better in the TNG ethos of how the universe works to have Picard shatter her and explain to her that she's wrong. Yeah,
I'd have to think about that. I generally agree with what you've said in looking at Sloan. I think that, yeah, I mean, I generally agree. I don't know that. I don't know. I'd have to think about that because Satie is quite diluted, and I think, and you've spoke to that a little bit, that it's her ego and losing sight of what's really there. I'd have to think more about that. I can see where you're coming from on that. I think Sloan is an interest. I think Section 31 does make sense. I think Section 31 is the only way all of it works. I also think Section 31 destroys the message that Star Trek is trying to send, or its original message. Mm-hmm. But I do think that Section 31 is pragmatic and makes sense. And I like that Sloan has a soul. Like, you also saw it in when the episode where he dies, or we at least think he dies, with so Bashir's caught him. I forget the name of it. Bashir's caught him, and he's talking to him. He could be trying to save his own life or try to talk to him, but I really think he was sincere when he says, look, I'm sorry that Odo had to die. I really didn't want to kill Odo, but this is the only way we have going forward. You know?
Yeah.
I thought he was sincere when he said that, because I don't think he honestly wanted to kill Odo, but I think he was willing to let Odo die to save the Federation. Kind of just going to what you were saying.
Yeah.
I agree when it comes to that. It's quite possible. I just never really placed those two together. I would say you're right, writing wise. If they were going to do a Section 31 in TNG, it probably would be Satie. That's probably how they.
I mean, they both are. They're both have the ultimate goal of protecting Federation values, right? That's the stated goal of both Satie and Sloan. I think that Satie, she talks about her father, and her father was a great thinker and a great philosopher, and to make them sort of debate the merits of the Federation and try to improve themselves and try to improve their understanding of the world. She eventually becomes zealous in that regard and is very myopic on what she considers to be the improvement. Like, so her destructive focus is because of how myopic she is. In trying to protect something, she's willing to not pay attention to what the actual threat is. Right. Sloan is very aware of the real threats to things, and he's more intelligent than Satie. I think he has a better understanding and can actually rationalize what he's doing, which makes it more compelling to me.
Right.
To bring it back to the other thing, it's just what I think. The only thing that I think implies something about this episode is that with that Kling book that I was writing about, if Satie represents the conservative prism, which is to protect civilization against barbarism, Picard in this episode actually represents the libertarian point of view, which I think is also interesting because it falls on the right hand of the political spectrum. So Picard is arguing that the state is being too coercive and it's costing people's freedom here in this episode, where she's digging around too much. She has too much power to look into people's lives. This guy didn't do anything wrong. Like, you need to prove that he did something wrong before we go down this. So I think it's interesting that it's less about the oppressor and the oppressed in this case, which would be something you'd identify more with Star Trek and Star Trek Twitter. And this is fascinating to me of how right-wing of an episode this is, because it has both the conservative and libertarian points of view buried within it. And it's rare you see that.
I think Star Trek and Star Trek Twitter are very far apart from each other, but I get what you're saying for sure. I mean, things are more gray than they are black and white, in my opinion. So, I can say that he's going more towards the libertarian values when it comes to that. And ultimately, my opinion is that it takes a mix generally. Like, no one ideology or specific thought has it absolutely right. Like, we've discussed that.
Certain points of view work with different arguments better. Like the example of the civil, like there are certain arguments that each point of view seems to win out against. So it's difficult to say that one of them will always be the superior point of view. Is that the point of that book anyway?
Right. I mean, there are instances I think you can nitpick and say one ideology fits a lot better than the others, for sure. But just looking at specifically her, looking at Satie again, her wanting to find any kind of double agent or any kind of threat to the Federation, and then her also saying, okay, well, this was clearly an accident. We do have someone who's lied. Looking into them isn't unreasonable. or looking into them, I don't think that's unreasonable necessarily. It's then she goes too far, and that's where I think the libertarianism in Picard, because Picard himself can be quite I don't want to use the word authoritarian, but he can be very much about the oppressed versus the oppressor and things of that nature.
Yeah.
I just think that she's gone too far in her direction, and that's why he moved towards a more libertarian.
Yeah, well, I guess it's the change that I saw in the past 5 years is that Picard, to me, like I think politically our definition of Picard being what would be considered like a classical liberal in this episode, which is that there's these sort of like Renaissance ideologies that he buys into. He's a very, believes in the idea of liberty. It's like everybody deserve their own due. It's a thing of individualism and stuff like that. It's changed drastically in the past 5 years since I've watched it. That would be the difference to me, is that 5 years ago he wouldn't have seemed so. I think this Picard seems strangely out of date in the modern context. If you look at like modern political discussion, Picard's argument here seems like it kind of makes sense, but it's also been like an undermined point of view, I think, to have. Like no one really respects that Picard's point of view, I don't think, at any point. Like I feel on a lot more people are willing to side with Satie in whatever thing that they're trying to go after. Like I feel like Satie is more of like, this is the way that we need to run our politics at this point. You need to witch hunt. You need to destroy the non-believers. There are sinners amongst us. It's all like this religious sort of language and stuff like that. And Picard's thing about leaving people alone, if they haven't, basically leaving people alone doesn't seem to be the modern context. So I like what he says in this episode, but it does feel like he's completely divorced from our modern political sense. Maybe not.
I mean, when you think about it, I guess there's a little bit, just based on the integers that you provided, I guess there's a little bit of liberalism or progressivism in him, in that he sees someone who shares the blood of an enemy as an oppressed individual, that they're looked down upon. And so the state shouldn't be used against them in that respect. I don't know. I haven't... I'd have to consider that more. I do think that, again, I would agree that Picard is not... While everyone agrees with Picard and identifies with Picard, I think very few people actually take his words and take his teachings to heart, like you said. I think that everyone has a belief or bias, religion, cult, whatever we want to call it, and that very few people see any nuance. You're either with us or against us.
Yeah. It's actually one of the things that make me, on our watch through of TNG recently, it actually is the thing that knocks Picard down as a character for me, is that the performance is a 10 out of 10. But I think Picard as a character is actually not that interesting. I find Sisko and Kirk to be much more compelling, interesting characters, where it's Picard's the paragon of virtue and everything like that, but he doesn't have a lot of flexibility or mysteriousness to him in the way that Sisko does. He doesn't have a kind of wilder outlook, a little bit more of like you can push him in different directions in the way that you can push Kirk in different directions. And I think the performance is still really great, but I think Picard, if Picard was played by any other actor, I think that the public perception of the character would be much worse than it currently is. I don't think people are coming to Picard for the way that he's written as a kind of like interesting thing that they would want to see. It's really Picard makes this, or it's Stewart that makes him work in a lot of different ways. I wouldn't say that about any of the other captains. Like if Sisko were replaced by a different actor, I think Sisko is still an interesting character.
Maybe. I have a hard time seeing Sisko as anyone else, but I understand what you're saying. I think Picard ultimately, when you take the summation of his entire character, I honestly find him to be and I don't want to get too far into it because I'm sure it's outside the scope of this podcast, but I find him to be the proto-human for Starfleet, as well as a Christian straw man, the straw man atheist that I've heard from some Christians. He seems to have some really great or he seems to have some nobility in a lot of the things he believes, but he also seems to really stick to certain ideals without at any point going outside. He won't even question them.
Yeah.
So it's his character is both great and tragic at the same time. And I think Patrick Stewart brings a lot to it. I would agree with that for sure.
Well, that's why he's so inflexible. You can't have a pale moonlight moment with Picard.
Oh, absolutely
because
not.
it breaks him in a way. Like that's just why I find Sisko more interesting to watch, even if I think the performance is worse. But I think Sisko as a character is just better constructed to handle a lot of different storylines, where Picard is the well-worn path of a character, which is kind of he's like a superior version to Kirk. He's the elevated man above Kirk in the TOS era, and he's in this new paragon of virtue sort of path where everything he does is the right thing to do. He never really thinks anything wrong. Anything he does wrong was forced upon him. It's not of his own will that something went wrong. Someone made him do something, and he feels sad about it. That's why the Borg storyline is the only thing they can do with Picard in the new series, because it's the only thing that has any kind of trauma attached to him that they want to pull out. So I just find he works perfectly for the show. But if you were to do a Kelvin version of the TNG crew, right, he's incredibly different to Kelvinize. Incredibly difficult character to Kelvinize. I don't know he would not be Picard if you stuck him into a modern Kelvin universe movie type setup. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for the most part, because I don't think you could write him in a way that would be done. I think, like, to your point, the way that I would look at it if I was going to write Picard and not use the Borg or whatever is, I would probably I'd probably do the question of, is the Prime Directive the end all be all? Is are the rules set by Starfleet, is the Federation really, the good guys in the end? That's the only other thing you could play off.
That's the insurrection plotline,
Yeah, but I mean, done better is what I would do if I was doing it.
But he's still, I think, even if insurrection was done better, insurrection is Picard clearly battling. Well, I guess it's not true because of how confused the insurrection plotline is, but Picard is clearly working for the little guy, the underdog in that.
Right.
Like there's not a pale moonlight decision of, I have to do something immoral to advance what's the best thing to do for the galaxy.
Right. And I mean, it would fundamentally change the character again. I agree with you. I'm saying in Picard, the only other thing I could think of was having him question this thing he's dedicated his life to. But again, that would fundamentally change the character as well. I think you could have vestiges of him in a Kelvin reboot, but definitely a more nuanced character would be necessary. I just don't think the always being right would really cling to audiences at this point.
Yeah,
I don't think it makes sense he's the proto Starfleet officer, but I don't think that's really. I think he stops being human to a point, because to be like perfect, to not get upset when people die, to always be above our core base emotions makes you not human anymore. Yeah. So I think they'd have to change him for it to be relatable.
Yeah. Back to the Drumhead. Favorite scene in this episode?
My favorite scene is probably a lot of people's favorite scenes. I really like the chain is broken, just because I like the messaging there.
Is that the Worf and Picard conference room scene?
No. That's when Satie, and I don't like it because it's the point when he takes down Satie. I don't like it for that.
Yeah.
But Satie's like, well, look at you. You serve the Borg. You've broken the Prime Directive 600 times or whatever. All forced, by the way, like you said, he never did it on his own. And he says, this reminds me of a story. And he starts talking about her dad, with the first link broken, the chain is lost or whatever. I like the messaging of that. And I like the way that he presents it. Like you said, he's a really good actor. And so I like the messaging and the way it's framed. Not necessarily because he defeats the bad guy, but just because, the way it is, the way it's put together.
Yeah. I like the Worf and Picard conference room scene, I think, even though I don't really understand the staging of why they're sitting at opposite ends of the table. I think it's thematically is to show how distant they are from each other at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But something really smart that I think that they did was make Worf the secondary main character in this episode, because Worf is the perfect character to be swayed by Satie and then eventually come back to Picard's point of view. It really wouldn't work with anybody else except for him because of how that character is set up. It even goes down to how the cold open here is so effective that it establishes that there was an accident, that this Klingon is the suspect, and it sets up Worf as the character because Worf escorts him back to his quarters and then assaults him and says, like, I'm going to figure out what the fuck you did no matter what happens. It's just a lot of groundwork being laid there. I like those two. I like Picard talking about a Drumhead trial. Where he doesn't call it a kangaroo court, which I think is the more popular name. That's probably a less exciting title, but I would have gone to kangaroo court.
I like how, and the thing is in my opinion, it's a little too subtle. I like subtlety, but I think this is a little too subtle. Where he, when he's doing his standoff with Picard, and he's like, well, if he doesn't have any issues, why would he plead the fifth? What does he have to hide? Mm-hmm. And then not like 4 minutes later, not just a few scenes later, it's brought up. It's like, well, your dad was a traitor to the Klingons. And he's like, well, that's nobody's business. That doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's interesting. And I wish they'd been a little more blunt, not too much, but a little more blunt with that. It's interesting when his history is brought up. Well, it doesn't matter as much. But if we're looking at somebody else,
not, do you mean just to wish there would have been more dialogue about it, less than like, because it seems fairly obvious that they're talking about his personal.
Correct.
Yeah.
But I wish he would have had a realization, or it would have been more emphasized, because again, he's all about going after someone else's history, because why should they have to hide anything? But then when it's questioned about his dad, all of a sudden we hide stuff. We don't need to talk about that. It's not relevant. It's really easy to come after someone else and say, what do you have to hide? Why don't you just tell us your full background until it's you?
Yeah.
And then there's a nuance to it. Yeah. I wish he'd had a realization, or I don't know. I'd have to think about how I would have written it to make it a little more obvious, but I would have given a little more emphasis on it for sure. My
favorite small moment in this one is that at the end, when the superior or the senior admiral comes on board to watch over this trial, the reason that that the whole thing is falling apart is he just leaves the room, which is fantastic. He does not stand up and go, "This kangaroo court will be called to a halt now by the grace of God," or whatever. Right. That would have been fairly awful. I really just like the fact that he just stands up and walks out of the room, and everyone is watching him go and knows what it means. But Satie is in the middle of her, brought down better men than you, Picard, you son of a bitch. I think that's a really effective moment that could have been ruined by having him say something.
I mean, I thought it was really brave to have her say "you son of a bitch" in the actual episode too. I thought that was fantastic. As a kid when I first saw. I agree. I think it's also really telling and really interesting that he comes at all. I think it shows. I think it's a good emphasis on how someone like her, and it ties into the end of the episode, how someone like her can really seem like she makes a lot of sense. Like the head of Starfleet security is coming. This is such a big deal, Yeah. And then he sees that she's quite gone. I think for me, the small moment, you didn't ask me, but if I was going to do a small moment, I would probably do, I think when you had Picard talking with the enlisted men, just, getting to know him, getting to have a better understanding.
What the hell's his name? His name is Simon Tarses, right? Simon Tarses.
Yeah.
That's his name now.
Right. Yeah. Just having a conversation, why did you do this? Why did you join Starfleet? And then really why did you lie? And, the more he talks about how, it's so natural. People hate the Romulans so much that could have kept me out. Mm-hmm. I think that was a good moment for sure.
brings up, I'm always conflicted about people who get fired 20 years down the line when it's revealed that they lied on their resume. That I'm always never sure how to feel about that, because the 20 years thing is the difference, I guess. Like, if you've been doing the job for long enough, I don't know what difference it makes if you lied on your resume. Like, if you lie on your resume and you can't do the job, that's one thing. But clearly this guy can do the job, and people who get fired from being like CEOs of companies or whatever can do the job. It is a weird ethical conundrum of how far you can push your resume before it becomes a problem and you prove that you can't do the job. But I always think about that in this episode too.
Well, I think there's a difference between militaries, of which this is one, and businesses. At the end of the day, I would almost agree with you. It comes down to trust. If you're going to lie at the very beginning, can you do it? And I think context matters too, right? I think that saying, "Oh, it's a Vulcan. My uncle was a Vulcan," is a natural lie to tell when people are bigoted or racist.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's a natural lie. Like going back to what you were talking about with civil rights and such in the 1950s, or in a worse place in like the being Jewish in 1940s Germany. If you could hide that, you probably would be inclined to. You know what I'm saying? So I think context really does matter. But yeah, I mean, at least for the military, I could see them making the argument, well, can we trust him or not?
Yeah.
But again,
they are the enemy. It comes down to Picard has Picard with his libertarian view in this episode it's all about his prior history doesn't mean anything. It's the individual is the point of how you view things. I
mean, I'm with you. I'd like to I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. No, but I'm with you. I'd like to think he kept his job and that ultimately everything worked out, because it just seems like wrong place, wrong time, and what I would consider a minor mistake. You know?
Yeah. And with the genetic history of those two species, just be like, oh, he told me he was a Vulcan. He's got pointy ears. I didn't ask any questions at that point.
Right. I don't know. Yeah, exactly.
How much do you really know about your grandfather anyway? I didn't know anything about my grandfather, so
He only came around like for one birthday. I don't know him if I saw him.
They all served in wars, but that's about like the extent of what I know.
Right, exactly.
Let's see. Anything else about the Drumhead? We talked about that. Talked about Satie. Last point that I'll bring up. I love hostile Betazoid character. I think that is an underutilized aspect of TNG when you have a group of telepaths, and this guy's the only one that I've seen weaponized in a way that he is also bad at his job. Like, it highlights a way that Troy could be potentially inept at her job, but this guy's like, well, he's definitely hiding something, and everyone goes, well, he's hiding something. I feel like Troy could say this person is hiding something about literally every character that she ever walks into, because everybody is literally hiding something. So I really enjoyed weaponized Betazoid. I wish they had done more with that, because it's a fascinating concept.
I like it showing to Picard how unethical he is with Deanna. Because if you remember at the very first of the episode, Deanna was basically that guy, right? Because she was sitting there with him. And he even brings that up. He's like, this is wrong. You shouldn't be using your Betazoid for that. And Satie basically said, well, you are too. Yeah. He's like, you're right. Yeah. Maybe I should, you when you're right, you're right. And at this instance, you're right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I wish that had more impact in the future. Like he had, because again, it was just a one-off and they don't really, look at it more than that. Yeah. But I liked that they weaponized telepathy and Betazoids. I wish they would have done it more, and that could have been an interesting either doing it in that episode that would have made it a little fool, or going into another episode where they really look at the ethics of having a telepath and using a telepath. And then, what would have been great is if they had talked about it and done it in TNG and then really leaned into it during the Dominion War. Yeah. Like, say the Vortas were really, or not the Vortas, maybe the Jem'Hadar were really open to Betazoid telepathy. Like, really, they couldn't resist it. And then really look at if that's something Starfleet should be doing. I think that I think that's a great point.
Yeah, it's something that builds into like Section 31. Section 31 would weaponize telepaths, I think. Like that would be the thing to do. I think this episode pushes back on it slightly just by, the Betazoid. I was going to say sort of like Satie, but I think Satie is wrong. The Betazoid never actually does or says anything factually incorrect. Like he is doing his job and sensing general dishonesty and that something is not right here, and he's correct about that. But I guess it goes to show more about how the general sense of being an empath and just getting a general sense of feelings is maybe not all that useful or helpful here. It's the Bill James argument from his popular crime book.
Right. I mean, it goes to the whole reason the fifth, I was going to say amendment, the fifth, whatever, exists. Yeah. Why pleading the fifth exists. Just because you plead the fifth doesn't mean you're guilty of what you're pleading the fifth for. Right. Because again, he's not factually wrong, but he is misleading because they were guilty of something, or they felt guilty at a minimum, maybe not even guilty, felt guilty about something, but it wasn't what they were looking for. So yeah.
When you the Simon Tarsi's character does something important. When you plead the fifth, do not continue by saying, "I plead the fifth because it incriminates myself." to answer.
I don't think Riker was the best lawyer in that. To be quite honest,
Riker's
was
a
quite
terrible lawyer. He's always given the lawyer job, and he's terrible at being a lawyer.
Yeah. Because there was a lot of times I was looking at that, and I was like, man, I'm not a lawyer, but I felt like he could shut Satie down quite a few times in what she was. Wouldn't have helped the pacing and wouldn't help the story, but I think there were times he probably could have shut Satie down.
Riker's greatest moment as the lawyer is when he takes Data's arm off and shuts him off, and he's like, "I've destroyed this machine," and then he sits down and cries about it in Measure of a Man. That's my favorite Riker as a lawyer moment. Yeah, he's not we've talked in previous episodes about, we don't have to do that, but like Star Trek's belief that just anybody can become a lawyer and anyone can step into the role of being a good defense lawyer is very laudable, I think, but kind of misguided.
Well, Gene's opinion on that, right? What Roddenberry wanted?
No, what's that?
He didn't want any lawyers. He said they didn't exist.
Right, they'd hash out their arguments without contracts.
Yeah,
and stuff
that lawyers didn't exist at all in the universe, and people had to override him and fight him on that. It was, so maybe at least we got some lawyers.
Lawyer. Yeah,
maybe.
Whatever that guy who was the lawyer for the first couple seasons, he probably just hated that guy so much.
Who took a lot of the credit and did a lot of
and rewrote scripts and stuff. Yeah.
And did a lot of unethical things. That could be. Maybe that's why he doesn't like lawyers. For sure.
Yeah, just find a better lawyer. That's all you got to do. I guess we're done with this one. So we usually rank these on a scale of 1 to 5. What are you going to give this one? I think I know, but it's nice to have you say it.
I mean, for the most part, I think it's really solid. It depends on when you look at the grading system. Like, does something have to be absolutely perfect to get a 5? If so, I'd make it a 4.5. But I don't generally do that. I think it's a solid episode. There's some things we discussed with it, but it's definitely a 5. I think it's one of the best of Trek, specifically when you're looking at morality versus I was about to say ethnicity, not that. Ethicality, I guess, if that's a word. And I think it's one of those things that, like you said, it's timeless and it can really speak to almost any. As long as we're going to remain human, then I think it'll be able to speak to generations.
Yeah, I give it a 5 as well. I actually don't think it makes many I don't think it has any mistakes in it, actually. I think it does everything within the confines of what a Star Trek TNG episode can do. I think it's aged remarkably well. I think that it is, as you're saying, just an excellent prism into how people's minds work as to what they think the actual enemy here is. I just see so much of the modern discourse about the witch hunts that are done by political groups, be it like the progressive left and the far right. It's like, this is just the new way of being that you do this kind of thing. And Picard's warning that you have to be vigilant about this and push back at it actually sadly feels like it's kind of failing in a modern context. I just don't think that people really respect those values anymore, which will be sad in a decade when we see where that leads us down the path of. But it's you should always be wary of people who are making a moral point and are determined to make that moral point no matter what the evidence shows. And I think that that's just a huge part of politics right now. And it's discouraging, but I think the Drumhead is a good warning against that stuff.
Well, there's two things I'd say to that. First off, I think the form it took was probably different, but I think that it's probably always been this way. I mean, maybe we can have a conversation about that at some point, just in different forms. And the last thing I'd say is, if you noticed, Picard, for 90 to 95% of that episode, generally stood alone. There were some people that agreed with him or thought, but for the most part, he was going up against Worf. He was going up against Satie. Starfleet security, the head of Starfleet security, was there to see this craziness that's happening. So the top echelons of Starfleet were even looking into this, this horrificness. And so he stood alone for a long time. And so maybe, I don't know if it stays to the episode, the prevalence will be there. I don't know that it will, but I'm just saying if it makes you feel better.
Like, every individual needs to stand up for themselves in these contexts?
I'm saying that he was the voice of reason and pointing out, how Satie has gone too far. And he stood alone for the long time. And you were saying, it feels like it's gone opposite that it, the conversation is changing.
Yeah.
But I think that the conversation was changing for most of that episode, and he continued to fight against it until he won. So, it's possible.
Yeah.
How likely? I don't know, but it's possible
I think
that people.
I think in the narrative of Star Trek episode, it is possible. I think that the current witch hunting online is so effective that being the individual is not enough to protect yourself against anything that way. You have to really stand alone. You have to be like uncancelable or whatever they say. Like, and a lot of people are, if you're famous enough or you have enough money or whatever. But I think that the effect of that is not on the individual; it's on a societal level that shuts down things. So the more the cloud overhangs everything, the less likely that any individual can stand up and say something because the cloud is too heavy to break through.
Right.
That's it for the Drumhead. Top 10 episode. I don't know where I would put it. There's a lot of episodes in the top 10. Let me see here. I'm just going to go quickly.
At least 10.
Yesterday's Enterprise, Best of Both Worlds. It's not better than that. Inner Light, no. Cause and Effect, no. Sarek and Darmok. It's ahead of the Survivors. So it's in 8th place on my current list. After Yesterday's Enterprise, Best of Both Worlds 1, Inner Light, Cause and Effect, Sarek, Darmok, and then I would put in the Drumhead and then the Survivors. That would be it. Bumps off Chain of Command Part 2 by doing this. So bye, Jellicoe.
Yeah.
We hardly knew you. That's it. Laura, thanks very much for coming on and talking about the Drumhead. Do you want to? People probably know, but do you want to tell people where they can find you?
Sure. Yeah, I have a channel on YouTube, youtube.com/Lore Reloaded, mostly known for Star Trek. A lot of it is analysis and just starting a conversation. So, talking about what we've been talking about before, if you're looking for echo chambers to hate on new Trek or Disco Era Trek, or you're looking to hate on Legacy or anything like that, and everyone agree with you, not a place to come. But if you like conversations and taking a look at Trek in a way that you may have not considered, then definitely youtube.com/Lore Reloaded.
Sure. Guys, check them out. Subscribe. Hit the bell, as they say. We'll be continuing with all of our Lower Decks and Enterprise coverage. There'll be another one of these interview guest podcasts coming up soon. I don't think it's been determined yet who's going to be or what it's going to be about, but they'll be out there. Thank you very much for listening. Support the show. Patreon.com/The Pensky File. It's the best way to do it. You get a whole bunch of extra content. Whenever this month, I think we talked about Tombstone this month. Might be the past month. So if you guys like Westerns, you can join the Patreon to find that out. Support us to ensure that we cover every single episode of Voyager, because that's always teetering back and forth whether or not that'll hold. You subscribe, you make it all the more likely that we'll do every single episode of Voyager before we turn 80 years old and die. Thank you very much for listening. Laura, thanks again for coming on. Good to talk to you.
Thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
And guys, we will see you later.